Okay, so firstly I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, their elders past and present. And I'd also like to thank Jean and everybody involved in the Loddon Valley Alcohol and Drugs Service Network. It's been a really interesting day for me. This is actually my first time in Bendigo. I am a city girl, so it's been fantastic to be invited up here and to get a bit of a sense of what's going on in the Victorian system. The recovery debate has been really interesting, so thanks Patrick for that and to everyone before us. So I'm also a researcher and not a clinician, so I don't have the one-on-one experiences that I think many of you in this room have in terms of alcohol and drug treatment delivery. So I've been learning a lot there too, and hopefully we can learn from each other here. So as Gina's invited me to talk about synthetic cannabinoids, and just to get a sense of how I came to this, I've just completed my PhD, which was about online drug discussion. So I'm interested in how the internet and new technologies affect the way drugs are used in terms of drug use trends, not just in terms of the way we can deliver services in a new technologies, but how drug users themselves are using the internet. So that's sort of where I came into this. And that became, I guess, an interest in drugs that are provided via the internet and through which a lot of information is being spread online. So last year we were seeing the rise of chronic and other synthetic cannabinoid products in Australia, as you would have seen, and my colleagues and I decided we would do a short online survey of people who use these drugs. So 316 synthetic cannabis users in Australia from all around Australia, rural as well as city, did the survey. And also from 10 years back, my supervisor is actually Simon Lenton from Perth, and his history is in cannabis law reform, and I did some work on that and the impacts of criminal conviction for cannabis upon users. So that's, I guess, the background and how I came to be interested in this topic. And so today I'd like to just look briefly about what these products are, who uses them and why, looking at the side effects and clinical recognition and management, and again, you guys may know more about that than me, but I'll just sort of put up some stuff there. And then I will spend some time on, I guess, the current legislative situation, the history, the status, and maybe we can chat a little bit about whether that's working. Okay, so you don't need to know much about chemistry. These molecules, if you look at them, one is THC, which you find in cannabis, the other is JWH018, which is one of the first synthetic cannabinoid products that sort of came out. And you can see that these molecules are very different. They just look very differently shaped, and I'm not a chemist. So what's interesting about this is that both of these molecules act on the same system in the brain, the cannabinoid system. And so they both produce cannabis-like effects, yet they're very different chemically. And what this meant in practice was that in Australia we have analogue laws. So I think this is from 1995 in the Criminal Code, which say that any drug that is structurally similar to another drug that is currently illegal is also illegal. So because this JWH set was very different structurally to THC, it was therefore legal. So this was sort of how these drugs became, I guess, available legally and needed extra legislation to deal with them. So there are many different brands, many different substances, and look, I'm just going to draw on the survey results as I go through to do some of this stuff, including on this slide. First we heard about the drug spice, then we heard K2, then chronic. And this sort of happened, I think it was 2004 in Europe was the first mentions of spice, and then 2008 K2 in the US, and in the last few years chronic here in Australia and New Zealand. And in the survey we did last year, and this was data collected between December and January, so only 6 months ago, and we asked, what was the brand that you had? We had Chronic, Northern Lights, K2, Zeus, Puff, Spice, Thai High, Aroma, Magic Dragon, and a whole bunch of other ones. And I'm sure there are new names now on the agenda 6 months later. We also had a small proportion of our sample talk about using non-branded synthetic cannabinoid powders that they had bought online actually as a chemical name. So maybe they'd gone to a website and ordered JWH018, used it in that way. And others were making their own blend. So actually you're spraying this substance onto an inert herb. And that's generally how these are sold, as you'd be aware, as an inert herb with the substances sprayed on. You can create a joint, a bong, however else you would use cannabis, you can use these substances. And the market characteristics that we found, local head shops were important, the internet, friends, adult shops and tobacconists. So these were the places that people were buying these drugs from. But it was interesting to note the internet was not centre. It was actually mainly shops that were local bricks and mortar type shops that people were buying these drugs. The median was 3 grams at last purchase, and this is obviously related to what the packages are. Obviously it's 1.25 and 3 grams. You can also buy ounces and gone from there. But 3 grams was the average level of purchase, and a transaction of approximately $60 was the median. It was interesting to me to find when I did an analysis of the cost that people paid that it was about $18 per gram. And certainly using say Melbourne or some of the other bigger city prices, that is actually more expensive than cannabis if bought by the quarter ounce. For other places, like in the NT, some parts of WA, maybe some areas, depending on their cannabis availability, it would actually be cheaper. So that could be a motivation for use as well. And in our sample, most found the drug easy to get. And this was an advertisement that we found a few months ago just on a street pole stuck up there in St Kilda. So yeah, certainly still being advertised. Who uses these drugs? About a month ago I was in the UK for a conference, and they had a legal high survey done in Germany. And I found it really interesting because they divided the sample into 2 groups. One was a cannabis-only group that really didn't use any other drugs and was interested solely in the synthetic cannabinoids. And the other group was a drug experience group that would have used this drug regardless of its legal status. It was simply another experience they wanted to have. So we found it kind of similar in Australia that most of the people that we surveyed were not they were not recent users of lots and lots of drugs. They were recent cannabis users, so this drug was definitely appealing to them. And there is evidence of appeal to drug-tested populations, which I'll get into in a moment. We didn't find much evidence of appeal of this drug to cannabis-naive populations. I guess there are some in the world, but almost all of our sample had used cannabis and they were relating that back to synthetics. So another interesting thing, I had a look at some of the clinical studies. People that have rocked up to hospitals and emergency departments are also looking through health records, and these are across the world. And for any kind of synthetic cannabis intoxication that they needed treatment for. And most of these cases were young people. They were teenagers, maybe 21, 22. And what we found in the Australian sample of a median age of 27 surprised me. I thought that the median age would be younger than that. And in fact, a quarter of the sample were 35 years and older. So I guess that's just a bit of an idea that this isn't something, maybe it follows the pattern of cannabis use where there is appeal for not just the young people. Not surprisingly, the majority were male, and in our sample was fairly well educated. As you can see here, most were employed. The unemployment rate was similar to the standard population rate. So, as with many online surveys of people who use drugs, we're not capturing a treatment population here. We're capturing a much broader population of people who use drugs for whom many of them don't see this as a problem. So, as I mentioned before, the other drug use of the people that we surveyed, just at the bottom of that slide I said last month use only of the common drugs, and that included cannabis. They had extensive drug histories, but they weren't current other drug users, if that makes sense. So we asked people why try this drug, why use this drug? And the first most common reason was curiosity. They were interested in how it compared, and many of them didn't rate it that well once they had tried it, but that was the reason why they went there in the first place. But the second reason is particularly important for policy, that at the time that they tried it, it is legal or was legal, or they thought it was legal, was a huge reason for using it. Being easier to get than cannabis. So we do tend to think of cannabis as easy to get, but it isn't that way for everybody. And then there was the actual effects that the drug produced according to these people. So I divided these into recreational and then sort of medicinal, fun, relaxation to get high, and these effects would be what you'd see for many drugs, I'd imagine. An alternative to cannabis, it was offered. It produced medicinal effects, and this is interesting. So relief from pain, nausea, anxiety and insomnia. And so we had a few people writing in the comments in the survey that they wanted to use cannabis for medicinal purposes. They didn't have access to it, so they used this drug, even though they didn't see it as potentially as good as cannabis. And finally, some people described using synthetic cannabis to ease off or reduce or even quit cannabis use. So I think these last two reasons are sort of, it's like a self-help thing that's going on here for people having trouble with their cannabis use. And in a New Zealand study, there were a couple of reasons that didn't occur in the Australian study. One of them was product consistency and the other was perceived safety. So out of 316 people, nobody said that they used synthetic cannabinoids because they thought they were safer than cannabis. That was not an attitude that we found, which is probably true. So, drug testing was the other reason. So only 8% of our samples said they first tried these drugs because they were concerned about passing a drug test, either a workplace drug test, a driving drug test, or a drug test for treatment, treatment entry or staying in treatment. We did ask people whether they felt they were subject to drug testing, and 20% of people said they were. And also we asked people whether they felt that synthetic cannabinoids were less likely to be detected than cannabis, and almost everyone said yes. So people understood that these drugs were something they could use without being detected by testing. I think that's a really important motivational point, and also perhaps an unintended consequence of the increased testing in our lives at the moment. So symptoms of intoxication. Now these are very much like issues with problematic cannabis intoxication. There are some differences here. One of the differences is the tachycardia is a really commonly reported in the clinical literature as a real problem. There have been some instances, there's one in WA last year of a man who had heart problems and unfortunately died of a heart attack after using these products, and it's quite possible that that was exacerbated by the product, given what we know about the propensity for tachycardia. There has been some reports of dependence and withdrawal. These are uncommon, but there are some reports. And the other thing that's a bit different to cannabis is on the physical side of things, the seizures. So the cannabidiol, which is another part of the cannabis plant, that actually is anticonvulsant. So to have seizures is actually a really something you wouldn't expect from cannabis, but it's what you're actually finding that from synthetic cannabinoids. So that's a real issue which sort of points towards these drugs being more harmful than cannabis itself. So just to say that these are based on clinical presentations, and one of the next slides is I guess our group and what they thought were the side effects. So I was just speaking with a clinician earlier. I think I don't know if she's still here, but looking at some of this rationale. So someone presenting with the signs and symptoms of cannabis use but who has a negative urine test for cannabis, and especially if they're in a situation where they're being drug tested or if they have otherwise unexplained psychosis. All of these things should flag that perhaps these drugs are involved. But some of these questions I think are really important, and one of my colleagues who also speaks on this issue in Melbourne, he works at PENDAP, Steve Bright, he sort of put these questions up for clinicians. He said, actually asking people what they've taken, and especially actually mentioning fake or legal weed or using those terms can be really helpful. And he found within his service that before he got there, people weren't asking the questions, and when he actually got them to ask the questions, suddenly they realised that these were issues that they hadn't actually detected before. Now we have a few treatments here, I guess recommendations, which are similar to cannabis, and that in the clinical research I looked at, most of these symptoms will resolve spontaneously once the drug is out of the system. Unfortunately, for people with previously diagnosed psychotic illnesses, this can exacerbate those, and those symptoms may stay around for quite some time, and that can be quite serious. So there's no specific treatments for dependence apart from what you'd expect for cannabis and other drugs. So in our survey, and this is back to the users who aren't necessarily having clinical issues, and we said the last time you used synthetic cannabinoids, what were the side effects? And it was interesting that only a third of them said there were no side effects. So 2/3 said, yeah, there were some side effects. And you see that fast and irregular heartbeat was the most prevalent there, as well as decreased motor coordination, which for some isn't really a side effect, it's probably an effect they were looking for. I guess you could say that about some of these, but some of them are associated with psychosis, dissociation, paranoia, and then psychosis there down the bottom. And on the second level there, a serious percent of 6, I actually then asked anyone that had experienced side effects, I said, okay, so experiencing side effects, were these serious enough for you to want to seek help? And 6 people out of the 291 said yes. Only one of those people went to hospital. Others got their friends to help them or felt it was serious enough but didn't actually get any help. And you can see there that they experienced a much higher rate of all those symptoms. So moving on to the legislative situation, a bit of a timeline here. So a lot's happened in the last 12 months in this space, as you may have seen. In April last year, there were some media reports, and I guess everything started to really build up in the media, especially in relation to the mines. And this was being driven from Western Australia, where there were reports that mine workers were using synthetic cannabinoids in order to get around the drug testing that was going on for their work. And so WA was the first state to legislate, and they added 7 synthetic cannabinoids to their schedules. And then we had lots of other states sort of moving around that time. I haven't mentioned them all here, I've just sort of stuck to Victoria. But in July, the Therapeutic Goods Administration banned 8 synthetic cannabinoid agonists. And that then, I'll just give you another graph here. We actually asked our sample when they first tried synthetic cannabinoids. And so this line is where the laws came in July of last year. And the majority of our sample around the first half of 2011 was when they first tried this drug, and then there's a real drop-off there. So I think the media frenzy actually, it was a bit of a snowball. Obviously people using the drug led to the media, but the media talking about the drug led to the using, and it just snowballed on from there. So then in November, Victoria legislated a temporary ban for 12 months of the same 8 chemicals banned by the TGA federally. And then in May, we've just had the TGA ban 8 broad categories. So they've done the broad categories, and then they've also banned what they've called any synthetic cannabinomimetic. It's very hard to say. So that's basically any drug that mimics cannabis in terms of acting upon the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So this is really an attempt, both with the broad categories and with this extra term, to stop these new variants coming up and being legal. So that it's an attempt to do that. Whether that's actually what's happened is yet to be seen. It's also worth noting that there are a couple of synthetic cannabinoid products that are registered as medicinal products by the TGA. So Nabinol and Dronabinol for multiple sclerosis, chronic pain and cancer. So they do have some medical uses. So, you know, the intended effect obviously is to reduce the availability of the targeted product. And to a degree that happened. So when in July, when we had the first lot of bans, suddenly those chemicals weren't to be found. A whole new set were to be found instead. So it did sort of have the intended effect, but there were some unintended effects. One of the unintended effects from the whole system is the not for human consumption issue. So if you want to sell one of these products and you want to get around the laws, you label it's not for human consumption, it's incense, it's potpourri, it's plant food, whatever it is, and then you can get around the laws. Obviously, if the laws are a bit different, you might be able to actually name the content, and you might be able to say, this is exactly what this contains, and you could go ahead and do that. Increased awareness of products, as I mentioned before, actually legislating against them increases awareness, and we've seen that in our data as well. We've also seen evidence of stockpiling before bans. So this is sort of an evidence of trying to get around the bans. It's harder to monitor trends in these hidden populations because the trends are going so quickly. So these drugs have moved into sort of our awareness in 2011 in Australia. It's quite possible in 2012 they're going to move out of our awareness. And in 2013, when our next National Drug Strategy Household Survey comes after 2010, it'll be as if they never happened. Because they weren't there in 2010, they may not be there in 2013. So our systems aren't really set up to, our research systems that is, to monitor what's going on here. And in the ecstasy drug reporting system, that's based on a particular sentinel group who aren't really so attracted to this product. So we found, less than 1% use last year in the report just come out. So we don't really have a sentinel group of regular cannabis users. We have regular ecstasy users, people who inject drugs on a regular basis that we monitor, but we don't really monitor the groups that are necessarily using these products. It will be more difficult to develop medicinal products based on synthetic cannabinoids with these new laws from the TGA, which basically say anything that works on that receptor system is automatically put into the highest schedule with no medicinal value, and we need to use it that way. And finally, there's a cycling through different lesser-known substances to evade legislation, which is what we've talked about. But here's just a couple of examples. So the chronic site, 100% Aussie new legal chronic now available. This came out at the beginning of July last year, just after the first lot of laws. And this one, new legal formula, 100% legal in all Australian states. So this is what happened last year. The new laws are to try and get around this problem, and there's some issues with that. So this last slide, first thing I need to say is I'm not a lawyer. I may get this wrong, and I'm doing my best to understand it, but that's a good disclaimer to put there. When I presented on this topic in April this year at in Fitzroy at the Yarra Drug Forum, we had some people in the audience from VicPol, and I said, from what we understand, and this is myself, my colleagues, other people I've spoken to, there was no Victorian laws around these products. We couldn't find them. We looked in the legislation. We did the best we could to try and find them. There was no communication that there were these laws. And it turned out I was wrong, and there were, in fact, these laws. And the kind man from VicPol sent me the laws. And funnily enough, they were on the website. We went to go and look for them. We don't know how they got there and whether they were there when we looked and we were just silly, or whether something else happened, we're not sure. But it was very difficult. If we couldn't have found them after days of looking, and many of us, how would we expect anyone on the ground to know they were there? I don't know. So this is a bit of a complexity. Today we've been talking about we've been seeing in action, I guess, the interaction between state and federal governments in our system here. There is also these interactions between state and federal laws, which are quite difficult to understand. Certain jurisdictions, we've been talking about the TGA. The TGA is a federal body that's looking after poisons and medicines. And somehow poisons and medicines have morphed into illicit drugs as well. You can see how that's happened. But that wasn't necessarily what the TGA was set up to do. What it's set up to do is approve medicinal products for medicinal use. So it's all a bit tricky. So the Victorian Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act 1981, Section 36B, we're going to go check this out later, actually links the Victorian Act to Schedule 9 of the TGA instrument, which we've been talking about, the SUSMP. So what that actually does is it says anything that goes into the Federal Act is automatically in the Victorian Act. So why would we need Victorian legislation? Why would we even need state legislation? Well, it turns out it's not that simple. And this is sort of what I thought in May the 1st. Well, doesn't that mean it's all illegal in Victoria? So for specific state laws to apply, it apparently is the case that an individual drug must be directly added to the state lists. So even though they're nominally illegal because of this connection between the two instruments, in practice that doesn't seem to be happening. And I think people on the ground can see that. Certainly what I've been seeing is that people are still selling these products directly from shops after these laws have been implemented. Hence, it gives you the impression that unless someone's waiting there until tomorrow to do some big bust of them all, that perhaps there's a bit of a problem with these laws. I don't quite know the answer to that yet, and time will tell, I think. So what I do know is that there are some states at the moment in Australia that are drafting new state laws to try and implement these at a state level, which gives me the impression that the federal laws, I guess, lack teeth. So, yeah, you get different stories depending on who you ask. So, issues with the May 1 ruling, and this is me talking to a lawyer friend of mine, as I disclaim that I'm not a lawyer. The first thing he said was that it's going to be much harder for people to prosecute because the onus will be on demonstrating that this product is indeed one of these groups or does indeed mimic cannabis. And it's not a simple thing to do. It involves a lot of expertise. It involves resources, more resources, to analyse the individual products in order to make these criminal convictions possible, of suppliers or of users even, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But so we have to think about these things when creating these new laws. And the meaning of cannabimimetic. Someone mentioned to me last week that some food substances act on the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So we're going to ban food. Are we going to ban anything pleasurable? There's many different substances that act on this receptor set in the brain. And the idea that we could ban every single substance that could actually act on that is quite outstanding to people that understand it. So this is yet to be shown in any court of law that this will have any effect. One thing I should say though is I've noticed that the US just passed some laws about a week ago with a very similar clause. So we may find that will get tested in the US as well. So I think we can safely say that there is some ambiguity in the current status of the legislative situation. So I just wanted to put forward, I guess, a more global, upon concluding here, question about what is the point. So the first thing is, does the government, does the community aim to reduce drug-related harms in the community through our drug policy? I'd say yes. Secondly, do we accept that there is an underlying demand for cannabis-like intoxication that exists in the community that is probably not going to go away? I think we can accept that, and that does not negate the need to provide treatment where it's required and where people want it, and to provide any kind of services that help people that are coming into trouble. But it does accept that there is cannabis use in the community and or a desire for that effect. So if we agree with those, I think we can also agree that we should create policy that shifts the market towards less harmful products. And that's obviously a different session as to what that might look like. But I don't think it's this. One casualty to end of legal ambiguity is just a story I'd like to tell about a friend of a friend, who really is a friend of a friend. A 22-year-old West Australian man who was caught with a small bag of chronic in July 2011. He bought it at a shop when it was legal. I think it was in June of that year. He was charged with possession of a prohibited substance. He could not access the cannabis-like penalties, which he thought he would be able to, because he didn't really understand the situation there. He had no prior offences. He ended up with a received spent conviction and a fine. And I felt that that was a real problem, that if I had been this young man and gone into, I don't know, a legal high store and bought a product that was in a store and happened to have it in my pocket when my mates stupidly, attracted police attention and they looked in my pockets and suddenly you are actually in possession of an illicit substance you didn't even know was illicit. So I worry about the social impact of that on that man and how he will feel about the legal system for the rest of his life. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for your attention and also thank some of the people there, including Victoria Police, who actually spoke to me, which is great. And if you have any questions, these are my details. But also, if you're interested in any PDFs of academic reviews on this, I've got a bunch of them. Happy to email them to you, because that's always useful if you're working with people and you want to know some of the reviews. So, yeah, anyway, thank you. Yes. And other synthetic cannabinoid products in Australia, as you would have seen. And my colleagues and I decided we would do a short online survey of people who use these drugs. So 316 synthetic cannabis users in Australia from all around Australia, rural as well as city, did the survey. And also from 10 years back, my supervisor is actually Simon Lenton from Perth, and his history is in cannabis law reform, and I did some work on that and the impacts of criminal conviction for cannabis upon users. So that's, I guess, the background and how I came to be interested in this topic. And so today I'd like to just look briefly about what these products are, who uses them and why, looking at the side effects and clinical recognition and management, and again, you guys may know more about that, 5 in the criminal code, which say that any drug that is structurally similar to another drug that is currently illegal is also illegal. So because this JWH set was very different structurally to THC, it was therefore legal. So this was sort of how these drugs became, I guess, available legally and needed extra legislation to deal with them. So there are many different brands and many different substances, and look, I'm just going to draw on the survey results as I go through to do some of this stuff, including on this slide. First we heard about the drug Spice, then we heard K2, then Chronic. And this sort of happened, I think it was 2004 in Europe was the first mentions of Spice, and then 2000 but I'll just sort of put up some stuff there. And then I will spend some time on, I guess, the current legislative situation, the history, the status, and maybe we can chat a little bit about whether that's working. Okay, so you don't need to know much about chemistry. These molecules, if you look at them, one is THC, which you find in cannabis. The other is JWH018, which is one of the first synthetic cannabinoid products that sort of came out. And you can see that these molecules are very different. They just look very differently shaped, and I'm not a chemist. So what's interesting about this is that both of these molecules act on the same system in the brain, the cannabinoid system. And so they both produce cannabis-like effects, yet they're very different chemically. And what this meant in practice was that in Australia we have analogue laws. So I think this is from 1995. Okay, so firstly I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, their elders past and present. And I'd also like to thank Jean and everybody involved in the Loddon Valley Alcohol and Drugs Service Network. It's been a really interesting day for me. This is actually my first time in Bendigo. I am a city girl, so it's been fantastic to be invited up here and to get a bit of a sense of what's going on in the Victorian system. The recovery debate has been really interesting, so thanks Patrick for that, and to everyone before us. So I'm also a researcher and not a clinician. So I don't have the one-on-one experiences that I think many of you in this room have in terms of alcohol and drug treatment delivery. So I've been learning a lot there too, and hopefully we can learn from each other here. So as Gina's invited me to talk about synthetic cannabinoids, and just to get a sense of how I came to this, I've just completed my PhD, which was about online drug discussion. So I'm interested in how the internet and new technologies affect the way drugs are used in terms of drug use trends, not just in terms of the way we can deliver services in a new technologies, but how drug users themselves are using the internet. So that's sort of where I came into this. And that became, I guess, an interest in drugs that are provided via the internet and through which a lot of information is being spread online. So last year we were seeing the rise of chronic